like this. What I found specifically in these sellers is this discomfort in where they were at today, like almost like they were striving, like they just would not be comfortable until this goal was met, and they would just keep going and going and going. As soon as they hit the goal, take a guess what they do. They set a higher goal. They don't take a break. They don't take it easy. They're like, okay, I did this. What's the next one?
Welcome to another episode of the Elite Selling Podcast. We're your hosts, Griffin and Frankie. If you're liking the episodes, if you're enjoying the show, do us a huge favor and like, subscribe, and share this with a friend. Let's get other elite sellers to join in on the conversation. Today, we've got an awesome guest for you. We've got Sean Burke. Sean is a partner at SBI, and before that, he's held leadership positions at companies like Prometric and LivePerson. And today we're going to be talking all about how to book $1 million as a seller with your W-2. If you're interested in learning what it takes, we're to go deep into not just the characteristics, but how to set yourself up for success. So without further ado, let's jump into it.
Sean, welcome to the Elite Selling Podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Griffin. Thank you, Frankie. This is going to be a fun conversation.
Absolutely. I know Frankie and I are ready to, we're ready to make $1 million. You know, I don't think, I have definitely not hit that threshold yet. I'll admit it, right, Frankie?
Still working on it.
Still working on it. But today we're going to break down the recipe, the formula of how to become a $1 million a year seller. Get that W-2. I don't even want to know about the taxes on that. I'm in California, so I might need to move to Florida where you are before I hit that goal. So, but before we get into it, before we put the cart before the horse, talk to us a little bit about the characteristics of $1 million seller. I know you've worked with a few, so would love for your take on what that looks like, where to start.
Yeah, no. And first of all, let me be specific here. The $1 million sellers that I work with did not start as $1 million sellers. And I think that's a different type of process if you're already at that. So these were, and by the way, there's 5. I've tracked all 5 of them. So there's a path that I found that they all went on together with me that got them to that number. And it's not what most people think. The first thing that it really starts about is you've got to be in the right environment in order to be able to do it. A lot of people think that, I can just go to any company and I can make $1 million. Completely untrue. It's a very special type of company, and the nuances of those companies that where you can make that not every rep realizes before they take a new job or they're in a job.
Yeah. So what does the right company look like? So if I'm a rep, I'm looking at maybe leaving my company, or I'm in between roles, in 2024, what does the right company look like? What are some of the signals that you're looking for to pick the right horse?
Yeah. By the way, I will say that in 2024, it's harder than it was before in certain areas. So I just want to be clear in that. So there are a few components. The first that I think is the most important is actually the timing of the company in the marketplace. So you've got to be able to find a company that is kind of on, I call them a wave, where they're in a growth wave. And they're usually the number 1 or number 2 player in their industry and in a growth rate. It's much harder to reach $1 million in an 8% growth company versus a 120% growth company. And the reps that I've seen do this well, they ride the wave of that growth of the company because a lot more people want to talk to you now because of what you're selling. So I can imagine right now, if you're selling at an AI company and you have a unique proposition, probably there'll be some $1 million sellers in there. If we look at the stock market, I don't know where it's at today necessarily, but NVIDIA's killing it. So you've got to be really wise about the timing of the company and what they're selling. So that's number 1.
Yeah.
Number 2, and most people don't think about this, is also thinking about how that company is valued in the marketplace. So if it's a publicly traded company, are they valued by revenue? Are they valued by EBITDA? A lot of private equity firms are valued by EBITDA. And when you're valued by EBITDA, then a lot of times growth will be sacrificed for profitability. And so they want to grow smart or grow efficient. And so the value of the multiple of the company is based off of EBITDA. And so they may not want to be as aggressive on price cutting or doing certain things in deals to allow you to get that revenue number up. So when you're thinking about companies, if they're valued on a multiple of revenue, or even some enthusiastic exuberance in the marketplace for just how cool and how hot that technology is, that's a good sign. Because if you back down to paying someone $1 million, if you're not adding well above, say, 5 times the value of that deal to 10 times or even more in the creating the value of the company, then companies are not going to want to pay you $1 million because they're not going to get it in the back end in valuation. So I don't know, there's a lot of reps that are going out and trying to figure out how the company's valued. But if you do, I think you put yourself in a better position.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, Sean. How do you, if you're looking from the outside in, you're not at the company yet, how do you determine what they're measuring? How do you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, if they're a publicly traded company, what I would just look at is what their market cap is versus their revenues and what that multiple is. And then just do a Google lookup and say, what's a normal multiplier for that industry? And are they is their market cap, that multiple, higher than what the industry is or isn't? If you're working for a private company, good luck. Like there's not a whole lot of information. You could do some industry research and try to figure out what it is. But typically you're in a private company, you're not going to be able to figure it out until you get inside the walls and you're talking to them.
So I think going back to your first point of finding the company that's in the hot space, are they a leader? Do they have a new product that people are interested in, or are they doing it really well? Using that as your first filter, if the answer is yes, then you can start to look at the second pieces that you just mentioned of revenue at all costs, or looking at EBITDA and trying to take as much of an educated guess as possible, but start with the first point, then go into the second point, is what I'm hearing you say.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you want to look at all of these things. And by the way, you can get there in an EBITDA company. You just have to make sure your deals are highly profitable. And usually when they're highly profitable, well, that means that you're delivering a ton of value, which we'll get into next. And when I say value to your customer.
Right.
Right. So,
yeah, I know we're just scratching the surface here. So you got more. Keep going.
Okay. Yeah. So the next thing is the deal sizes in that company have to be 7 figures or more. And depending on the industry, it's always dangerous to throw out numbers, but I'm going to do it anyways. But if you think about the finance team and the leadership of sales, they're going to have some number of ratio on your OTE, your on-track earnings, versus what you've got to sell in revenue. And some are in the 4 to 5 times range. So if you sell $1 million, you've got to bring in 4 to 5 million. Some are even higher where, if you want to make $1 million, you've got to sell $10 million. So I think it's really important for you to know what your OTE is in reference to your quota. And so you can just see it. So if your OTE is 300 grand, then, and your target quota is 4 million, you've really got to hit the accelerators hard and sell well above that number. So it's just being wise about how you can make money in the company and kind of tying off all the numbers around it.
So we've talked, so picking the right company, you got to make sure that the deals are 7 figures. Talk to us a little bit about the specific roles though, because I know at my current company, there are 7-figure deals, but they're being closed there's some that are being closed by net new logo hunters. And then there are some that are being closed by, account managers. They're more farming side. Talk to us a little bit about those 5 sellers that you know and that you've worked with. What was that kind of makeup? Was it mostly new logo, a little bit of mix?
They were all hunters, all new logo.
Got it.
And in the instances that
listen to that,
yeah,
go out
all
with
new
hunters. Logo. Come on.
Yeah,
I love that.
Yeah. Not to say that you cannot make $1 million as an account manager. You absolutely can.
Yeah.
But in my specific instance, they were logoed companies that you would talk about in your investor report every quarter. And they were like all the deals that my team that, they all hit over $1 million. They all were the type of logos that everybody would know likely. And they were announced in the investor meeting, and like the stock in a lot of those cases would respond to the number of logos and the deal sizes and things like that. So yeah, hunting typically pays more than farming.
Okay, what's next?
Yeah, so the next thing is the commission plan. So there are some absolute must in a commission plan. And I'd also say that this is a cultural thing that you've got to look for in the company. Is the company has to want to pay people $1 million. They want to encourage it because they know what that value creation is on the top line. But the two things that I think are most critical in the actual comp plan itself, I'm not talking about quota and things like that, but in the comp plan itself, number one, it usually has to be uncapped because almost, I think every single one of my $1 million producers was above the 100% threshold where it was uncapped. And then the second piece is there has to be accelerators for overperformance. So those are the two things that I would look in the comp plan. So you're starting to get a feel for this isn't just how I sell. This is like, do the economics in the business allow me to make $1 million or not? So I think that's super important.
I want to make a blanket statement and see what you think about this. But with the favorable comp plan, you said something really key where you need to be at a company that wants to pay their people well, that wants to potentially give somebody a check for $1 million at the end of the year with a W-2. In general, from my experience, I've seen those types of companies as either companies that are founder-led with people that are super hungry, very aggressive, get after it, not afraid to get in sales calls, or usually a sales type of leadership like a CEO or CRO that has the biggest voice. I don't know if that's the case all the time, but I'm curious what your thought is if somebody could go look at the leadership and kind of see what they're talking about just as a data point. What's your thought there?
No, I think you're spot on. I think any CEO that's actively out talking about the business and actively selling, and if you go through their LinkedIn profile and they have a background of sales, I think it's just, CEOs all have different profiles. There's product-driven CEOs, there's financially driven CEOs, and there's sales. They come in all shapes and sizes. But if you want to limit your risk, working with a CEO that has a sales background and is on that growth trajectory is definitely super important because when you sell these types of deals, it really takes an entire support of the organization to go out and do it. And so that's like another key component is like when you're interviewing and you're talking about these things, like what support will I have? And the answer you really want to hear is if you're going out and you're closing multiple, $1 million plus deals, you have whatever you need. And that's what you really want to hear. So that it's another thing to check for, as you're looking for a role.
Yeah, you want leaders that are willing to bend the rules, jump on a plane with you, change some of the product roadmap, maybe if they need to, do all sorts of creative things. Obviously, not at the cost of all the other customers, but flex that creative muscle from the executive leadership down. It doesn't need to just be one way. So that's a huge point you just made.
Yeah, I wouldn't say bend the rules necessarily, but I would say that they have to be motivated to try to find a way for it to make sense for both parties and put the resources against it. And a lot of times that takes a good finance partner, good legal partner, good product partner, good support. It really does take a tremendous amount of effort, sales engineering, whatever industry you're in. It does take quite a bit of people to pull off, what I would consider a transformational deal, and which are usually the 7-figure plus deals.
So we have a makeup of the company that we're looking for, and we're given a great recommendation and like profile of the type of company for our listeners that want to make $1 million to go after, right? It's hot space, leader in the space. They're on the growth wave. Valuation is favorable. You've got 7-figure deals that are being closed. A great way to benchmark that is if you're interviewing, go talk to existing reps. Managers and hiring managers, they may give you a different story, but a rep at that company who's had success will let you know what's going on. So just a quick plug there. You're seeing more on the hunting side. So look for a role that's more new logo, new business focused, favorable comp plan. You've got the backing of executive leadership, your support. So we have this profile of the company, but let's maybe switch gears a little bit to the profile of the reps and what makes them unique, because you've seen a handful in your experience. I'm curious, what are some of the consistencies that you're seeing, skill set, drive, and what are you seeing that's consistent about those reps that have made $1 million?
Yeah, great point. And just one more piece on the company too, is you've got to interview your direct leader really hard to make sure that they're comfortable taking you on this path, because there are some leaders out there, I'm not saying all, but that could be jealous. Like it's an ego thing that they're like, wow, my reps are making a ton more than me. They may be afraid of what that comp will create in the business to highlight them. Because when you're starting to pay people over $1 million, finance is going to look at, there's going to be a lot of people looking at what's going on in your organization, and not all leaders have an appetite to do that. And so it's just something really important for the rep to know is like, do I have a leader who actively wants me to get a W-2? And what I'd want to encourage everybody who's listening to this is that when you're able to build a team where people make $1 million, you will naturally attract the best salespeople out there. Word of mouth it's like the, rising tide lifts all boats. It really does. So it is kind of a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's the last piece on the company. Let's talk about the reps. So without talking about specific skills yet, the first thing is the rep has to know the comp plan inside and out. Like even like things like, if a deal gets above a certain size, can it fall outside of the normal compensation and be recalibrated based off of the size of the deal? Like one of the things that happens is when you break a comp plan, everybody starts to look at how that comp plan is in there. And some people will get nervous and say, hey, look, we have an out clause that if a deal gets above a certain size, we can change the way the commission is paid on that. If you don't know that going in, then you could be on the back end thinking that you're going to make all this commission dollars on it, only to have that commission be changed because it's outside of the normal parameters of comp. So the one thing I would tell reps is understand how comp is actually created. Like there are literally, in every one of my organizations, there are graphs that we would create based off of certain scenarios around the reps. And most of them, like the line that they're all going to is, what is the OTE? So you do this blend of quota and OTE, and does the return make sense? And then when they start looking at the escalators, a lot of people forget about the escalators when you put together the comp plan until they hit. So you've really got to understand that comp plan inside and out to make sure that you can actually, you don't run into an issue after the deal is sold. And the other thing I will say on the comp plan is, inside the company, when as a leader and as a salesperson, this is something that I work really hard to do, is I would get out and warn the company before a deal is closed that it's going to kick somebody into the $1 million mark, because you want to be ahead of that versus behind it. You don't want to react and everyone freaks out later. You want to say, look, we're getting close to this deal coming in. And if you look at our comp plan, here's what that looks like. Does everybody understand that this is what's happening? And bring it up, because what ends up happening is if you don't do that, the deal happens, then everybody kind of freaks out. that first time that commission has to come out, and all of a sudden your phone's ringing, you're getting chats, you're getting texts like, oh my God. Like, so you got to be careful to make sure that you're giving early warning signals on that. So that's number one.
That's great. Yeah, I love that. And that's how you start to reverse engineer where you need to spend your time, what products they might want to focus on, how much is service important? Do you want to focus on services? Like all the little tweaks, because every single piece of a deal matters, especially when you start to get into those 7-figure deals. So it's not just about, if we're in software sales, the software that you sell, but maybe the length of the contract, maybe the timing, maybe the pieces that go into it. If you're rolling out a new product, your company's rolling out a new product, maybe they're giving you an extra kicker on that. Maybe there's a spiff. So there's all sorts of things that go into this. And it's not just the bigger the deal I close, the more money I'll make. Obviously that's generally true, but there's pieces along the way that you can plug into your deal to make sure you're maximizing your comp plan. So great point. I love your next point. I'm excited to hear about it. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, so you got to know your numbers. So one of the things that I think was really powerful, and I think as a leader is really powerful, is that we run sales velocity across all of my sales organizations. So I'm always looking at the velocity of the entire sales organization. And what that really is your average deal size times the number of deals that you have in the pipeline times your close ratio divided by your time to close. And that gives you kind of what the velocity of sales are. Well, a lot of people think you just do that for sales teams. We actually created in our CRM dashboards that showed all of our reps, what their velocity was based off of their pipeline and their unique numbers, their average deal size, their average time to close, their average close ratio. So it was almost like their map or their, business plan in a box. And then we could work off of it. And so then when we're working deals, we could say, things like, well, if we increase the price a little bit here, what does that do to the deal size and the close, like all these things? And then what does that do to your commission? So it gives you kind of optionality. And so like there is actually quite a bit of math that goes into figuring this out, but it will also tell you if you're nowhere close to ever being able to hit that number. And that's really important. So I would say, do that. And then in parallel with that, I always recommend that reps get really, really close with the RevOps team and look at how other reps are selling and where they can learn from those other reps. Because imagine if you want to make $1 million and you're sitting or you're virtually sitting right next to someone whose close ratio is, 10 points higher than yours. What in that RevOps data about how they sell can help you learn what you need to learn to get your close ratio higher? If they're selling faster, what are they doing in the sale? And so every quarter with our teams, we would come together and look at these things and just say, like, why is Joe doing this? And why is Susan doing this? Like we kind of collectively would come together as a team. Again, like a rising tide lifts all boats, is that we'd learn from each other and we'd compare those numbers, and we'd always have RevOps in the boat with us, making sure that we had all the numbers and accuracy. The other thing that's good on the leader side of that is when you have, by the way, some of the components of $1 million sellers is they're super focused, and therefore like the CRM probably isn't their number one priority, but because they know that the data that they put in will allow them to learn from the other people that are on the same path as them, they're more likely to get involved and make sure that their exit criteria are right. They're closing it out all the way through. They're tracking all these numbers, and it kind of gets them more in line with making sure that their data is accurate in the CRM. And that way, when we're all comparing things together, they can say, hey, we're all managing our pipeline the same way and all of our opportunities. So we can speak intelligently about why is, rep X going through discovery and moving it through a stage 10 days faster than everybody else while maintaining the close ratio. Like you can really geek out on it, but this is it. Like, it's not easy. Not everybody makes $1 million. So like, if that's your goal, you got to dig in and figure these things out.
Well, what it sounds like right now is we're talking about how to find the $1 million sellers, like using data to hone in on those $1 million sellers. I think like a lot of this is good stuff, but I think what we'd love to learn more about is the specific characteristics about a $1 million seller, how they sell. What's unique about their approach? What's unique about their execution, their delivery? What do they focus on? Do they just hammer pipeline generation? Do they just go after the biggest accounts? Do they just focus on the big business problem? Like, well, let's get into, okay, now that we've identified those $1 million sellers and we find those best sellers, what's unique about them?
Yeah. So they're really wise about running their business. So the first thing is they have a very defined ICP that they really only work on. Like they're not going to go work on fringe cases because it decreases the likelihood that they're going to hit the number. And they want to have proof points with other companies that have done, like if you have an ICP, let's just say airlines. If you have a case study that shows the value that your solution created for another airline, $1 million seller is going to know that. Like, I'm not experimenting with this client. I have a referenceable client that I can bring them into. Like, they're not going to be the first ones to do it, but they tend to really focus on a very specific ICP that they work really well. In a lot of cases, it's an industry that they either care passionately about or they've worked in before. So the ones that I've worked with, they either had like a telecommunications background and they worked in telco for 20 years so they could speak the language, or they worked in retail for years and years and years and they knew all the players in it, or they were intimately involved in the brand themselves. So that's the first thing, is they have a tight ICP. By the way, they didn't have massive pipelines. They actually had a smaller deal count than everybody else because they only wanted to work on the deals that they knew had a high probability of closing and that they had case studies to back what they were saying in the sale. And they started out very early on in the process of selling, making sure that the impact of the sale that they were making to the client had enough ROI to justify the cost that they were going to need to invest to get them into the accelerators and the triggers. And so the three things, and I'm going to steal this from John McMahon because he's owned it much longer than I have, but they look at three things in the early days of accounts. Is why do they have to do this? So when they're talking to a company, is this something that they literally have to do? Like, there is so much urgency, there's so much demand. There's just no way they're not going to do it. And if there isn't that urgency, then they're going to go find somebody else who has that urgency. That's number one. And then the second thing is, why do they have to do it now? Like, what inside the business is causing them to do this now? And what you can see is they're building a business case up for this. And then finally, why your company? And I think those case studies of doing it before really help them position themselves as, this isn't our first rodeo, we've done it. So in the early days, what you'll see is they may not let as many things into their pipeline, but the ones that they do, their win rate is much higher than everybody else because they know that they can't work every deal. And so they got to work the right deal. So I'll just stop there and see if you guys have any questions. Then we can talk about literally how they sell, this is kind of all background. Like, we haven't even got into like the actual sales motion that they're taking yet.
Yeah, I think this is great. And one example, as you're talking about a rep being passionately involved in who they're talking to, like maybe they have that telco background or whatever it is. I've heard stories of people getting in and becoming users. Like, let's say you're selling to an airline. They're probably a frequent flyer on that airline. If they weren't before, they're making sure they're just randomly taking flights during the week and documenting their experience on maybe how their company could help them. And I've seen even reps, for example, put out like an open letter to the CEO of like, here's my experience, here's how we can help. It's like, you can't do that if you're going after 20 accounts, probably even 10 accounts. So you got to pick 3 to 5 accounts that you can go all in on and try and hit that number. So I think less is more. That's a great theme, but you have to have, like you said, you have to have your team, your internal team on board with that. So these are all awesome points.
Yeah. By the way, that exact example is what one of my
What company
one of my $1 million guys did.
Can you share what account it was?
No, I wouldn't share any account
Okay, all right.
specifics,
Well,
I'll tell you the gentleman's name at the end, and you can talk to him about it.
all right. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
probably heard the story through the grapevine. So
You
seeing
probably
Burke,
did, and if
yeah,
you heard it, it's true. It's absolutely true.
yeah.
A letter to
All
the
right,
CEO, and all the mileage that the entire company did shown to the client. Yeah,
wow.
it was a pretty
That's what
pretty
it
good pitch.
takes. I mean, that you don't get that from somebody that's doing 100 deals at once. You have to have that focus. So that's
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah. And maybe for your team, because there's a few other things we could talk about, but let me give you some things that we did that you're not going to probably hear anywhere else, that are nuances that will get you in the mind of doing it. So first of all, my $1 million sellers, here are some of the things that they did. Frankie, your example, that is one. Number
Mhm.
two, they worked so intimately with their client that they had a badge to work inside of the business, and they would literally sit with the teams working in the business that they were trying to help with a badge, and they were there for weeks and weeks at a time. That's example two. Example three, imagine walking into a presentation to a restaurant chain with their food with you. So you're taking your lunch order with them. However, what the client doesn't know is that every single one of the bags, every single piece within the food, and even the cups themselves were custom made by us with QR codes that took them to a bot, that took them to the technology that we're using. And they were like, you got to be kidding me. They're sitting there like, what is that QR? Like, and we didn't say a word. Like, they literally figured it out with like, we don't have QR codes on our stuff. Like, this isn't your stuff now. This is where we think you could go. So that type of creativity, you don't see that much. A third or a fourth example is when we were selling a large retail chain, we actually took the senior vice president and we flew to one of their central areas and we drove around to every one of their stores and talked to the owners, sat down with them, watched them do what they do. I mean, if you really want to show that your solution is going to solve big problems and get very close to the client, you have to be willing to do things that nobody else is even thinking of to enable that buyer to trust you so much with that, because it's a political risk, or that's a career risk for them to put that much in you. But those are all things that we've done as part of this, goal of getting to seven figures for the reps.
So good.
That point around creativity is so undervalued and appreciated in, I think, the career path of sellers. And it's such a great highlight of an example of someone who's just paid so much attention to detail that they've thought about how they can stand out in the sales process, or as an account manager looking to expand into other areas. And the first point you made around getting on site and being in person as much as possible, Frankie and I were talking about, I think this summer, as we head into summer 2024 and beyond, the amount of teams that are going to be tracking in-person on-site meetings with clients is just going to skyrocket, because I think we're going to over-rotate back to the importance of seeing people face to face.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the last point, because I know we're coming up on time, is that none of them sold the same way. Like, I have 5 different profiles for the 5 people. So the first one was this will not be denied approach, where no matter what was thrown at them, they were going to figure out a way to get this deal. Like, it was so like, or to get the number, they just, you could shoot them 10 times and they were just going to keep coming at you. The second one was what I call goodwill hunting. This person was so brilliant that they could think 2 or 3 clicks ahead of the client and imagine what that business is going to look like in 2 or 3 years, and attach the solution to where they're going to be versus where they are now. The third was just pure hustle. Like, it doesn't work for everybody, but the one rep that I talked about that had the badge, he spent more time inside the 4 walls than I think a lot of their employees did. And he just knew that was going to want to take, because it was a very, the deal itself, there was going to be a lot of people coming, like there was going to be a lot of competitors in it. The fourth profile is the super creative. one where they were just doing things and showing things that were completely different. And the fifth profile was just unbelievable instincts, where they could walk in a room and they'd be like, they're in, they're out, they're not happy, we need to do this. Like, they could read a room and create a scenario that would make sure that everybody in the room had their needs met and their questions answered, and they were all shaking their head. And they didn't even realize necessarily that the person just knew how to read the situation so well. And we would even, like, for some of these large presentations, we would take a break and recalibrate, mid presentation, to go back in and make sure that we met that. So
that's good. So you would literally pause, go chat amongst yourself, come back, and then that's good. I like that.
Yeah.
Those 5 points are great, where I think we all can see ourselves in probably a little bit in each of them, but leaning into the one that maybe calls you the most, or the one that you can actually feel like yourself in. But it all starts with the 2 or 3 points that we made about finding the right company, finding the right ICPs within your accounts, and then going from there. Sean, as we wrap up, is there anything else that you want to make sure you share with our listeners before we ask the last couple questions?
Yeah, I think for anyone who wants to make $1 million in sales, the best resource that I could give you is one of my reps that I work with to do it. His name's Brandon Fluharty, and he is all over LinkedIn. I mean, I can't even imagine how many thousands of followers that he has, but he shares his path to do it and what he's learned across the process. The reason why I like Brandon so much is he actually did the work, and I saw the work. So out of everything, I could read a book and tell you what somebody else did, but I was with him during that time. And Brandon is very giving of his process. And he talks about how tough it was for him to do it. He didn't start there. And the fact that he was able to pull it off is a pretty amazing story. And I think you'd learn a lot from Brandon.
We had Brandon on the podcast.
Oh, fantastic. Well, yeah, Brandon. Yeah. Oh, that's where you got. Okay. I'm putting it together.
I love
Brandon.
There you go. Yeah. Now it's all coming back full circle.
Yeah, there you go.
This is incredible.
Brandon's
so,
great.
Sean, as we wrap, I know you have a newsletter that you publish every other Saturday, right? Tell us a little bit more about that before we ask our last question.
Yeah. It's called The Levers, and it's I had a newsletter before, and I just didn't love it. The Levers is really for 3 groups: the C-suite, leadership, and sales and customer success. And it's all about the levers that you can pull and move within your business to hit the goals that you want. So things like rev ops, things like sales enablement, things like pricing. So it goes out every other Saturday morning at 7:30 a.m. because most of my readers are executives, and they would never read this during the week. So it's very purposeful. It's less than a 5-minute read, and it's short and punchy. So yeah, that's the leverage. You can link to it from my LinkedIn page. I have a little a little logo there you can click on.
Yeah, we'll make sure we drop that in the show notes. And yeah, as somebody, Sean, you've been seven exits, 7 CXO positions. So definitely a good person to learn from. And we appreciate you walking through everything. We'll make sure that we get the notes out to our listeners so that they can walk through the examples that you shared. But as we wrap, Sean, we asked every guest this: how would you define an elite seller?
Yeah, so I'm going to steal 100%. I'm admitting. So I'm going to steal this from Wayne Gretzky because I think that he knows more than me about excellence. So what he found in any percent, by the way, this goes beyond sales, is there's 2 things that need to happen for you to be elite in anything. Is number 1, you have to have at least some raw skills to be good enough to do that. Like, I'm not going to go out and play for the NFL. I don't have that makeup, whatever, but like you have to have a unique set of skills that will allow you to play at that level. And usually you find those out through the course of your career to know if you could play at the level. But then the second thing, which I think is way more important than that, is you have to be so passionate about that thing. Like, let's call it sales. So you have to have a base of skills, but you have to basically almost be willing to sacrifice a huge part of your life to that level of expertise and doing what nobody else would ever do. You see this in great athletes and great musicians, and anything that people do really well, they're probably pretty good at, and they're probably willing to do what nobody else is willing to do to reach that level. And there's like this, what I found specifically in these sellers is this discomfort in where they were at today, like almost like they were striving, like they just would not be comfortable until this goal was met, and they would just keep going and going and going. And then the last point I'm going to leave you is, as soon as they hit the goal, take a guess what they do.
On to the next thing.
They set a higher goal. They set a higher goal. Yeah. They don't take a break. They don't take it easy. They're like, okay, I did this. What's the next one? So hopefully that helps out the listeners, and they know. So once you reach $1 million, then I'm pretty sure if you can do it. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I love it. You're speaking our language. And if you're listening and you've gotten through the episode this far, you're probably one of those sellers that is a little uncomfortable being complacent with the status quo, and you're willing to really dig into your profession and make sure that you're as best as you can. So we appreciate you listening. And Sean, thank you for jumping on. Thank you for all the insights and really telling the tales of the 5 sellers that got it done in many unique ways. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for jumping on today's episode of the Elite Selling Podcast. Frankie and I really appreciate your time. I know our listeners do as well. Thank you. So let's wrap up with some key takeaways. Let's go back to the top of the hour, the top of the conversation. In order to make $1 million a year as a sales rep, you have to pick the right company. You have to pick a company that is growing. You have to pick a company that is a leader in their space. A company that wants their sales reps to make $1 million and has a comp plan to support that. I think these are things that we tend to overlook as sales reps. We might think of OTE. We might think of brand names, logos that have purchased the software, but really understand where your company that you're applying for or working at, where they are in their growth journey, and are they leader in the space. So that's obviously number one. Number two is your comp plan. Understand your comp plan inside and out. Don't just give it the once over. Don't just give it the glance over. Okay, study that piece of paper, because it's the key and can be the key to you making $1 million a year as a sales rep. And then lastly, while we appreciate that there are sales reps in the mid-market and commercial space and high volume sales that can make a lot of money, Sean's experience, he talks about the importance of closing big deals in the enterprise. I mean, that I think is where the majority of $1 million a year sellers are coming from those 7-8 figure deals, which tend to take place in the enterprise. So put yourself in that position, do what you have to do to get into that position in the enterprise. And hopefully you listen to the podcast to get you there. But again, those are the 3 key takeaways from this episode. Sean, thank you again. We really appreciate it. And yeah, we're looking forward to having you on again soon to talk about how to be a $2 million seller.